During a family trip, I woke up inside a small boat in the middle of a lake alone with my 11-year-old daughter. No oars, my parents and sister were gone. There was a note, "You chose this." I didn't cry, I did this. 9 hours later, my parents and sister were calling their lawyers in a panic. My name's Sadie Collins, I'm 36 years old. Life since my husband Mark died has been about one thing, keeping the world steady for my daughter Lee. It's been a year of quiet routines, of packing her lunch just right, of working the late shift at the diner so I can be there when she gets home from school. Our world shrank, but it was safe. So when my sister Brianna proposed a weekend at a lake house, no cell service, just family time, I hesitated. Her invitations always felt like summonses, her generosity a debt I'd later have to pay. But she insisted, her voice syrupy over the phone. "It's a reset, Sadie, for all of us, for Lee. She needs to see her family, to be outdoors." She framed it as a gift, a way for us to reconnect after a year of what she called my hiding away. I knew what she really meant. She wanted to talk about our aunt's inheritance again, the 43 acres of land left to me and only me. She'd been hinting for months that it should be in the family trust, managed by our dad. But I'd said no, and my no was a stone she couldn't seem to swallow. Still, the idea of a reset was tempting, a few days away from the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of our quiet house. Brianna came over the night before we were set to leave. She brought a peace offering, a gleaming silver thermos, the expensive kind she loved to show off. "I filled it with that chamomile lavender tea you like," she'd said, her smile perfectly polished. "For the drive, to help you unwind." That thermos was the first note in a song I didn't know the words to yet. When we arrived, the cabin was surrounded by a thick forest of pine, and the sharp, clean scent was everywhere. It was supposed to mean peace. It was supposed to mean a fresh start. I breathed it in, convincing myself that maybe this time she was just trying to help. I packed our bags, clinging to that fragile hope. The lake house was beautiful, all polished wood and big windows looking out onto a sheet of glassy water. It was isolated, exactly as promised. Brianna was the perfect hostess, buzzing around the kitchen, making coffee and pulling out a map to plan a boat ride. She chattered on about how we all needed to reconnect, to be a family again. My daughter Lee, who was 11, was practically vibrating with excitement. It was her first real trip since her dad passed, and I saw a spark in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a year. She ran down to the dock, her ponytail flying behind her, and for a moment my guarded heart relaxed. Maybe this was a good idea after all. That afternoon, after a simple lunch on the porch, Brianna appeared with the silver thermos. She unscrewed the top with a flourish and poured the steaming tea into 2 mugs, one for me, one for Lee. "A special blend," she said, her eyes twinkling, "to help us all relax before our big boat adventure." It smelled right, like chamomile and lavender, but when I took a sip, it tasted oddly sweet, almost syrupy. I glanced at Brianna, but she was busy fussing with Lee's life jacket, her back to me. To refuse would have been an insult, the start of a fight I didn't have the energy for, so I drank it. Lee took her mug, wrinkling her nose. "It's super sweet, Mom," she whispered. I just nodded, forcing a smile. "Drink up, honey, it's a treat." She trusted me, so she drank it too, finishing the whole thing because I did. A few minutes later, we were all on the boat. The sun was warm on my skin, and the steady drone of the motor was hypnotic. I leaned my head back, the scent of pine and lake water filling the air. My eyelids felt heavy, like they were weighted down with tiny stones. I remember Lee yawning, a big, dramatic stretch before she leaned her small body against mine. Her head found my shoulder and then nothing, just a heavy, dreamless dark that swallowed me whole. I woke up to silence. A dead, total silence that felt wrong, unnatural. The gentle rocking of the boat had stopped. The drone of the motor was gone. The sun was no longer warm and gentle, it was high and brutal, beating down on my face. I blinked, my mouth thick and dry, and pushed myself up. The shore was a distant, blurry green line, much farther away than it should have been. Lee was slumped beside me on the vinyl seat, her face pale and damp with sweat. She was breathing, a shallow in and out, but when I shook her shoulder, she didn't stir. "Lee, honey, wake up." Nothing. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. I stumbled to the back of the boat. The key was in the ignition, but when I turned it, there was only a dead click. I lifted the engine cover. The fuel line wasn't broken, it was cut, a clean, deliberate slice. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked around the boat, my eyes scanning for anything to help us. The oars were gone. The bright orange box that held the emergency flares and first aid kit gone, the anchor gone. The boat had been stripped of everything useful, leaving us adrift in a floating metal shell. Then I saw it. A single piece of white paper folded neatly and pinned under a smooth gray rock on the boat's floor. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The note was typed, impersonal and devastating, just 3 words that stole the air from my lungs. You chose this. It wasn't an accident, it was a message. And in that silent, sun-scorched moment, I knew exactly who sent it. The sun was a hammer beating down without mercy. Lee's skin was flushed and her lips were starting to look dry and cracked. She was still unconscious, lost in a drugged sleep I couldn't pull her from. Staying in the boat felt like a death sentence. We'd cook out here. Waiting for rescue was a fantasy. Brianna had made sure of that. We were too far out for anyone to see us easily, and with no cell service, there was no calling for help. There was only the sun, the still water, and a dwindling sense of time. I found a half-empty water bottle rolling under a seat. My own thirst was a fire in my throat, but I ignored it. I carefully lifted Lee's head and dribbled a little water into her mouth, hoping she'd swallow instinctively. She did. I poured the rest over her face and neck, a small, useless gesture against the oppressive heat. I took Brianna's typed note and flipped it over. Using a pen from my pocket, I wrote my own message, my handwriting shaky. My name is Sadie Collins, my daughter is Lee, I went for help, please help her. I tucked it into the pocket of Lee's shorts. Leaving her alone on that boat was the hardest choice I have ever made. It felt like tearing myself in two, leaving the better half behind. I kissed her forehead, my tears mixing with the water on her skin. I'll be back, baby, I whispered, a promise that felt impossibly huge. Then I slipped over the side of the boat. The water was shockingly cold, a thick, algae-scented soup that made my skin crawl. It jolted my system, clearing some of the lingering fog from the drug. I picked a point on the distant shore, a tall pine that stood out from the others, and I started swimming, each stroke a prayer, each kick a defiance. The boat grew smaller and smaller behind me, a tiny white speck holding everything I loved in the world. My arms burned with a pain I'd never felt before, each pull through the heavy water an agonizing effort. My legs felt like lead, numb and useless. More than once I swallowed a mouthful of gritty lake water and came up choking, my lungs screaming. But every time I thought about stopping, about letting the cold water pull me under, an image of Lee's pale face flashed in my mind. Lee, alone on that boat, vulnerable and waiting for me. It was a fire in my gut that burned hotter than the pain in my muscles. It was the only thing that kept me moving. I don't know how long I was in the water. Time had dissolved into a rhythm of stroke, breathe, kick, repeat. Then my knees hit something solid. Gravel. I half crawled, half dragged myself out of the water, collapsing onto the rocky shore. I lay there gasping, my body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable chill despite the heat of the day. After a few minutes, I pushed myself to my feet and stumbled through a thicket of trees onto a dusty service road. The world spun, my vision blurring at the edges. I saw the plume of dust from an approaching car and waved my arm, a feeble, desperate gesture. The car, a new-looking sedan, sped past without slowing. A second one did, too. My hope began to curdle into despair. Then an old pickup truck, its paint faded and peeling, slowed down. The driver, an older man with kind eyes and a weathered face, rolled down his window. His name was Hank Porter. "Ma'am, you look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice calm and steady. I tried to speak, but only a choked sob came out. I took a deep, ragged breath and forced the words out. "My daughter, she's on the lake." Hank drove me straight to the marina, his hand steady on the wheel as I shivered in his passenger seat, wrapped in a dusty blanket he kept behind the seat. He'd radioed ahead, his voice a calm beacon in my panic, explaining the situation in short, clear sentences. By the time we pulled up, the park rangers were already mobilizing a boat. The wait was the longest hour of my life. I paced the dock, dripping water and mud, ignoring the stares of the few people around. All I could do was stare out at the vast expanse of water, searching for a speck of white, and then I saw it. The ranger boat was coming in, and beside it they were towing our small, stripped-down vessel. As they got closer, I saw her. A ranger was helping Lee sit up. She was awake. They brought her to the dock, and I ran to her, pulling her into my arms. She was groggy and confused, her eyes glassy, but she was safe. Someone led us to the small local clinic to get checked out. A detective was waiting for us there. He introduced himself as Eli Rowan. He was a tall man with a quiet, patient demeanor that put me slightly at ease. He listened without interrupting as I told him everything, the words tumbling out of me in a frantic rush. The family reset, the silver thermos, the cloyingly sweet tea, the cut fuel line, the missing oars, the typed note. I pulled the damp, wrinkled piece of paper from my pocket and showed it to him. "You chose this?" He took it carefully, placing it in an evidence bag. "Do you have any idea who would do this, Miss Collins?" he asked, his gaze steady. My voice was a raw whisper. "My sister." "Brianna?" He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "He told me he was having the clinic run some tests on both me and Lee to check for any drugs in our systems. It's just procedure," he said. But I could see the question lingering in his eyes, the professional doubt he was trying to hide. He was trying to figure out if I was a victim or a frantic, unstable mother who had spun a wild tale. Just as the doctor was finishing with Lee, they arrived. My parents, Diane and Peter, swept into the small clinic, but they didn't rush to me or Lee. They came flanked by a man in a crisp, expensive suit who radiated an unnerving calm. My sister Brianna was with them, her face a mask of theatrical worry, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Her husband, Trent, my brother-in-law, stood slightly behind her, a hand on her shoulder, his expression grim and supportive. This wasn't a worried family, this was a strategic formation. Brianna rushed forward, but not to me. She went straight to Detective Rowan. "Oh, thank God you found her," she cried, a masterful performance of a terrified sister. "Sadie, we were so worried, you just disappeared." She glanced at me, her eyes filled with what looked like pity but I knew was pure poison. My dad put a protective arm around her, glaring at me over her head. "We looked everywhere for you, Sadie. We were about to call the police." The lie was so bald, so audacious, it almost took my breath away. My mom wouldn't look at me at all. She fussed over Lee, her face a familiar mask of disappointment, as if I'd done this just to inconvenience everyone. The sharp-suited man stepped forward and introduced himself to the detective. "I'm Graham Pierce, the family's attorney." An attorney? They had called an attorney before they even knew if we were dead or alive. They presented a unified story to Detective Rowan, a carefully constructed narrative of my supposed decline. I was depressed, they said, unstable after Mark's death, prone to strange episodes. The boat trip was their loving attempt to help me, and I must have wandered off in some kind of depressive fog. The clash was immediate and brutal. My reality, the drugged tea, the stripped boat, the note versus their fiction. This wasn't a rescue. This was the second wave of the attack. Detective Rowan called me the next day. His voice was different, the professional skepticism replaced with a grim certainty. "The reports from the lab came back," he said. "Both you and your daughter had high levels of a powerful prescription-only sedative in your systems." He named the drug, something I'd never heard of, and said it was the kind used for severe insomnia. He added that the dose in Lee's system was dangerously high for a child her size. The words hit me like a physical blow. The thought of what could have happened to her, of how close we had come, made me sick to my stomach. He told me they'd gotten a warrant to search the lake house and had recovered the silver thermos from the kitchen counter. "Your story is starting to line up, Miss Collins," he said, and it was the first time I felt like someone in a position of authority truly believed me. It felt like the first clean breath after being held underwater for too long. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling. He said they were bringing Brianna in for formal questioning. The validation was terrifying. This was real. This wasn't just a cruel, twisted prank, it was a criminal act. They had actively tried to harm us. Before he hung up, Detective Rowan warned me. "Your family is going to push back," he said. "Probably hard." He had no idea. He was right about the pushback, but I never imagined the form it would take. 2 days later, a courier in a crisp uniform knocked on my door and handed me a thick, intimidating envelope. It wasn't from the police. The return address was the law office of Graham Pierce, my family's lawyer. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside was a legal document, a petition for an emergency psychiatric evaluation. It was filled with page after page of calculated lies, twisting my grief into a narrative of complete mental collapse. It cited Mark's accident, my decision to work nights, my social isolation from the family. It painted a picture of a woman who was a danger to herself and, more importantly, to her own child. They were trying to have me declared an unfit mother. The goal was so transparent it was sickening. If I was legally unstable, a court could give someone else control over my affairs and over Lee. They wanted to seize control of my daughter and, with her, the inheritance they'd been after all along. The 43 acres my aunt had left me. This wasn't just about punishing me for saying no anymore. This was about erasing me completely so they could get the money. The police brought Brianna in for questioning, and according to Detective Rowan, she gave the performance of her lifetime. He called me afterward to give me a summary, his voice tight with frustration. She cried. She claimed I'd been acting erratically for months, that she was deeply worried about my mental state. She told them I must have gotten the sedatives myself. She suggested it was a failed suicide attempt, a cry for help, and that I was now trying to blame her to cover my shame. It was a story so twisted, so perfectly designed to prey on every stereotype of a grieving widow that a part of me feared they would believe her. She even had an explanation for the note. She claimed I had been writing strange, disjointed things in a journal for weeks, and that the phrase was something I'd become obsessed with. She painted the lake trip as her last-ditch effort to save me, to bring me back from the brink. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. But her arrogance, the same arrogance that made her think she could get away with this, made her careless. When the detectives asked for permission to search her home, she agreed immediately, confident they'd find nothing to connect her to the sedatives. She was so focused on spinning her web of lies that she forgot about the simple, physical evidence. They took her home printer, they dusted the silver thermos for fingerprints. While she was busy creating a character for them, the real story was being told by a ream of paper and a smudge of oil from her thumb. The petition Graham Pierce filed forced a court hearing. I had to drain what little savings I had to hire a lawyer, a woman who looked at my case with a mixture of pity and disbelief. A few days later, I found myself sitting in a sterile, beige room across from a court-appointed psychiatrist. He had a kind face, but his questions were like carefully placed scalpels, designed to peel back my composure and find the instability my family insisted was there. "Why do you think your sister would do this to you, Sadie?" he asked, his pen poised over a notepad. "Have you had feelings of persecution before?" My family had provided him with a thick folder of their evidence. It was a collection of my own life weaponized against me. There were emails where I'd told my mom I was tired. A text message to Brianna where I'd canceled plans to go shopping because I had to work. Every normal expression of grief and the stress of single parenthood was reframed as a symptom of a crumbling mind. They were building a cage for me out of my own words, my own sorrow. I just sat there and told the truth, my voice as calm and steady as I could make it. I described the boat, the silent lake, the feel of the cold water as I swam for my daughter's life. I explained about the inheritance, the 43 acres of land, and the relentless pressure campaign that had been going on for months. I laid out the facts, one by one. The psychiatrist's face was unreadable. I left that room feeling exposed and powerless, my entire life picked apart and examined by a stranger who held my future and Lee's in his hands. The wheels of the justice system turn slowly, but they do turn. The forensic reports came back, and each one was another brick in the wall of Brianna's lies. The lab confirmed that the paper from the note, "You chose this," was a perfect match to the ream of paper sitting in the tray of my sister's home printer. And the analysis of the silver thermos was even more damning. The only clear fingerprints found on the lid belonged to Brianna, no one else's, not mine, not Lee's, just hers. The evidence was now so strong that the district attorney's office was fully involved, and they were preparing to file formal charges. Detective Rowan called me and said he was bringing my parents, Peter and Diane, in for separate interviews. He was clear that they weren't being treated as suspects, at least not yet. They were material witnesses. He told me his strategy later. He put my mom in one small interview room and my dad in another, and he just let them sit there, alone with their thoughts, for nearly an hour. The silence in those rooms must have been deafening. He didn't start the interviews with accusations. He started with simple, practical questions about their concern for their granddaughter. He asked my mom why, when they realized Lee and I were missing from the lake house, no one had called 911. He asked my dad why they didn't immediately alert the marina or the park rangers. He kept circling back to one question that had no logical answer in the story they were telling. Why was their first call to their lawyer, Graham Pierce, and not to the police? My mom broke first. She was never built for that kind of sustained, quiet pressure. My dad could bluster and intimidate his way through anything, but my mom always crumbled. She started, Detective Rowan said, by defending Brianna, her voice watery and pleading. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she'd insisted. It was just supposed to be a lesson, to scare her a little. Rowan had gently pressed her. A lesson about what? What had I done that required such a terrifying lesson? And then it all came pouring out. She admitted it was about the land. I was being stubborn and selfish by refusing to put it in the family trust where it belonged. She laid out the whole ugly plan for him. Brianna was going to put a mild sedative in our tea, just enough to make us sleepy. Trent, her husband, would disable the boat motor before we left the dock. They would let us drift for a few hours, long enough for me to feel scared and isolated. The plan was for them to come out on another boat and rescue us later that afternoon, after I'd had plenty of time to sit and think about my choices, to come to my senses. They never intended for me to swim to shore. They certainly never intended for the police to get involved. They had pictured a scenario where I would be so grateful and so shaken that I would finally break, sign the papers, and we could all go back to being a happy family, pretending it never happened. She kept insisting they never meant to hurt Lee, that her getting drugged was an unfortunate accident. But they did drug her. They left my child stranded on a lake under a blazing sun. Her words were empty, meaningless excuses in the face of what they had done. As soon as my dad heard that my mom was talking, his story crumbled into dust. He was a bully, but he was also a coward. He tried to minimize his role, of course, calling it a stupid idea of Brianna's that had gotten completely out of hand. But he couldn't deny the truth. He admitted he knew about the plan from the beginning. He knew about the drugged tea, the disabled boat, everything. He had funded it, paying for the cabin rental and encouraging Brianna's scheme. He went along with all of it. With my parents' sworn statements, the district attorney had everything needed. It was no longer just my word against Brianna's. It was a conspiracy laid bare by the people who were supposed to protect me. Brianna, Trent, and my parents had all played a part. As Detective Rowan relayed this to me over the phone, I didn't feel rage or even satisfaction. I just felt a strange, hollow calm settle over me. There was no going back from this. There was no family to save, no relationship to salvage. The family I thought I had, the one I had grieved for and tried to reconnect with, was a lie. To them, I had been a problem to be managed, an obstacle to be removed, and finally, a target to be neutralized. "I'll testify," I told Detective Rowan, my voice flat and empty of emotion. "Against all of them." The bridge wasn't just burned, it was vaporized. I was on my own with Lee, and for the first time since Mark died, that felt like a strength, not a weakness. A few weeks after my parents' confessions, with the legal proceedings grinding forward, an elderly woman I didn't recognize knocked on my front door. She had a kind, wrinkled face and sharp, intelligent eyes. "You must be Sadie," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm Mabel Grant. I lived next to your Aunt Carol for 40 years. I invited her in, my mind racing. She told me she'd been following the story in the local paper and was horrified by what my family had done. She said my aunt, my mom's sister, had always spoken so highly of me but was deeply worried about the rest of the family's influence. Carol was no fool," Mabel said, sitting primly on the edge of my sofa. "She knew what your sister was like. She saw right through your parents." Then she reached into her large handbag and pulled out a small, worn shoebox, the kind that once held a pair of children's sneakers. It was tied shut with a piece of old twine. "She gave this to me a month before she passed," Mabel explained, holding it out to me. "She said to give it to you if you ever looked like you were in a real fight with them. She said you'd know what to do with it." I took the box, its cardboard soft with age. I had no idea what to expect, but as my fingers brushed against the twine, I felt a tremor of something I hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. Later that night, after Lee was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the box. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were letters, dozens of them, all written in my Aunt Carol's familiar, spidery handwriting. They were all addressed to me, but she had never sent them. They were like a diary of her intentions, a private conversation she had been having with me for years. She wrote about the land, how she had scrimped and saved to buy the 43 acres piece by piece, how she'd worked it herself, and how it had become her sanctuary from the world, and especially from our family. And she wrote about me. She wrote about watching me grow up, about seeing a quiet strength in me that even I had never recognized in myself. One letter, dated just a few months before she died, made me stop breathing. "I'm leaving the 43 acres to you, Sadie, and you alone," she wrote. "Not because you're the oldest, but because you're the only one who knows how to say no. You're the only one they can't break. They will try, my girl. They will push and pull and try to make you feel selfish and small, but don't you let them. That land is your freedom." She knew, all along she knew they would come for it. She knew they would pressure me. The letters were her final act, her vote of confidence from beyond the grave. This wasn't just about a piece of property anymore. It was a responsibility she had passed to me. It was a shield she was trying to give me and Lee. Tears I didn't know I had left to cry streamed down my face. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for her too. Those letters changed everything. My motivation, which had been purely reactive, a fight for survival and justice, now became proactive. This wasn't just about sending my family to jail for what they did. It was about building the future that my Aunt Carol had envisioned for us, a future free from their control and their greed. The very next morning, I called my lawyer. I told him I wanted to set up an ironclad trust for Lee. I wanted the 43 acres placed into it with legal protections so strong that no one could touch it. Lee wouldn't be able to access it or be coerced into giving it up until she turned 25. It would be completely and permanently out of my family's reach. My lawyer explained it was an irreversible choice, a final severing of that asset from any potential family claim. It was a declaration of war in the only language they truly understood: money. My goal was no longer simply to survive their attack and see them punished. My new goal was to dismantle their power over me and my daughter, piece by painstaking piece, and to salt the earth so nothing like this could ever grow again. First, there would be justice in the courtroom, then I would secure justice for the future. I was no longer the grieving widow my family tried to portray me as. I was not their unstable victim. I was my aunt's legacy. I was the one who knew how to say no, and my no was about to become a wall they could never tear down. The town turned on a slow, soft hum the week the charges went public, like a distant engine that never quite dies. At first it was small things: neighbors giving me a wide berth in the grocery aisle, the woman who used to bring Lee cupcakes at school events pretending not to see us. I noticed the change in the way people smiled around me, the way their eyes skimmed my face and looked away, polite but guarded, like someone who had been told a difficult secret and didn't know whether to believe it. Calls came at odd hours from people I barely recognized, voices tight with curiosity and caution. "Are you okay, Sadie?" they'd ask, and I could hear the undertow behind the words, "Are you dangerous? Do you really deserve that land?" It was as if my life had become a bright beacon, something to be watched and judged. Rumors have teeth in small towns. They gnaw at the edges of every conversation until the rumor is the only thing left. People who had spent Sundays at my mom's kitchen table now clutched their handbags a little closer when they walked by my driveway. My mailbox filled with anonymous notes, sometimes just a single sentence, sometimes poorly folded clippings from the paper. A pastor who'd once offered me quiet counsel stopped returning my calls. I found my name in a social media thread started by someone with more venom than facts, and the comments were a litany of assumptions. They painted me as the unstable woman my family's lawyer described on paper. I could feel my life thinning out little by little until the fabric that had kept me and Lee safe looked nearly threadbare. Sometimes the whispers were kinder. "We hope you get through this," people would say, but you could hear the pause, the doubt, the bated breath before the word hope. I realized fast that in the absence of a clear, loud truth from my side, other voices would fill the vacuum. Brianna's friends began to show up at every town event, sleeves damp with sympathy, their eyes asking questions I didn't want to answer. I stopped going to the farmer's market because strangers would come up to Lee and ask about her mother's episodes in front of her. I found myself avoiding the grocery store at the times I knew certain people shopped. Where once I'd waved and exchanged recipes, now I kept my head down and moved through aisles like someone trying to be invisible. I kept thinking of my aunt's letters and they felt like armor, but armor can't stop every whisper. The whispers cut deeper when they found my husband Mark and turned him into a weapon. I hated the way people began to fold his name into conversations like a way to discredit me. Old classmates, people who had known us both for years, asked in those small, insinuating tones, "How are you holding up after Mark?" As though grief justified any strange behavior. Then someone, Trent, or one of Brianna's allies, started to say it out loud at a fundraiser a few towns over. That Mark would have been ashamed of me, that I was sullying his memory by dragging family into court. I heard it from friends who thought they were helping by passing along the rumor, and each repetition sharpened the cruelty. They turned our private sorrow into public judgment. They said I'd changed after Mark's death, that I'd retreated into myself and become fragile. They held up my night shifts at the diner as evidence, who works nights unless they can't handle the daytime, and pulled normal acts of care into a narrative about instability. For a while, it made me doubt myself. Late at night, I'd lie awake and ask the hollow, ridiculous questions. Was I overreacting? Would Mark have wanted me to make them all suffer? But those thoughts never lasted because they were the wrong question. The right one was simpler. Would I let them take my daughter's future? Would I let them rewrite our lives to suit their greed? Remembering Mark didn't make me weaker. It was the fuse to my stubbornness. He used to say small things that would stick to me like duct tape. "Don't let anyone make you small, Sadie." He fixed things with blurbs of practical wisdom, and when people tried to weaponize his memory, I found that instead of erasing him, they were sharpening my grief into something useful. I started keeping a list of small proofs, a picture of the two of us on the porch swing, the recipe cards he'd scribbled his notes on, a voice message tucked away where no one could reach it. When someone said he would be ashamed, I remembered the night he wrapped his coat around my shoulders when Lee was sick and said, "We get through this together." I used that memory like a talisman. It steadied me in cross-examinations, in late-night calls from reporters, and on the days when Lee's fear made the smallest sounds explode into panic. The uglier the gossip got, the more careful I became about where we went. Kids started whispering in school pickup lines, and parents who had shared birthday cakes with us began giving thin smiles and steering their children away. One afternoon, a woman I had known since high school cornered me in the parking lot behind the library. Her voice was low, as if she was afraid of being overheard. "I just don't think this is the kind of fight you should be having," she said, palms open like a peace offering. "Think about Lee." The implication was clear. "You're destroying us all." She didn't see the tiny, trembling note still tucked in Lee's pocket, the one I'd written on the boat. She didn't see the sleepless nights, the way Lee had come home with dirt under her fingernails from the dock and wouldn't sleep without the light on. It was easier for people to gossip than to stand up for a quiet mother who'd been betrayed by the very people she trusted. The whispers cost Lee friends quicker than I could find her new ones. At PTA, a rumor spread that my family was falling apart because I wanted money, not justice. A mother I'd once trusted pulled her child out of the same after-school club Lee loved. I sat in the empty parking lot afterward and held Lee while she cried about kids she'd known since kindergarten who suddenly pretended not to know her. It was unbearable. I couldn't let them carve our life up bit by bit. I enrolled Lee in a school in the next town over, one with a counselor I'd checked out beforehand and a teacher who didn't know the Collins name. The move felt like exile, but it was an exile we chose, a clean cut from the poison that had crept into our days. We packed up what we could on a gray, unremarkable Saturday. Lee hugged the dog's stuffed toy tight and whispered, "Will they come for us here, too?" I kissed the top of her head and squeezed her hand until she stopped trembling. "Not if I can help it," I promised. The new school had a different rhythm. There were fewer sideways looks, fewer whispered biographies of my supposed breakdown. We had quiet mornings and long walks past a park where the air smelled like cut grass instead of pine. The move didn't erase the headlines or the courthouse dates, but it gave Lee a place to be just a kid again. It gave me space to breathe and to plan. Still, the legal fight had to continue. With my lawyer's help, I drove down to the county seat to dig into something that had been nagging at me ever since Mom's confession. Why the sudden push for that land? Why the rush? I walked into a building that smelled like old paper and municipal coffee, my palms sweaty against the folder of documents I'd brought. The clerk's office was small, with a long counter and a bulletin board plastered with notices about permits and meetings. I tried not to let my heartbeat show as I explained who I was and why I was there. She introduced herself as Nora Bennett and had the kind of efficiency that comes from years of working at a counter where people ask for things they can't always have. She listened to me, not like someone indulging a piece of local drama, but like someone who had seen enough human stories to know the quiet ones mattered. "We can look up recent filings," she said, tapping away at a computer with a practiced hand. The room hummed with the low sound of the machine and the distant clack of a stapler. I watched her face as she scrolled through the records, the lines between her brows tightening with concentration. She found a zoning request, a preliminary plan that mentioned nearby parcels and possible consolidations. She read it aloud, the words dry and official, and then paused. "There's also an offer letter on file," she said, and my throat went tight. She printed a copy and slid it across the counter. "You can have this for your records," she offered. It wasn't much, but the paper felt heavier than I expected in my hands. There was a planning department stamp, a date. I thanked her, my voice shaky, and tucked the sheet into my folder. It was a small thing, a municipal notation in a room full of paperwork, but it hummed with the suggestion that something bigger was out there, waiting for me to pull at it. Nora's voice was steady as she explained what she'd found, but the words felt like stones dropping into a pond. "They've been filing quietly," she said. "A big company national from out of state has been putting together a plan for a distribution hub. They've been buying up parcels nearby." She clicked the printer and handed me a sheet. The paper had a planning stamp and a printed letterhead that made my stomach drop. It was a formal offer letter from the developer. I stared at the numbers even though I already knew what they meant. $2,400,000. The number was huge in a way my life had never known. Nora kept talking, but I was only half listening. The room smelled like old coffee and paper, and the hum of the computer was suddenly too loud. I traced the edge of the paper with my fingertip like it might tear if I moved too fast. Then she said the part that felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't addressed to the trust, she said. It was sent to a person, Brianna Collins. My throat closed around the name like a fist. Brianna had received it 6 weeks before the trip to the lake, 6 weeks before they drugged my daughter and left us to float. I remember the absurdness of the moment. The clerk's small office felt too small for the size of the truth. "Do you have any idea why?" I asked, hearing my voice go thin. Nora shook her head. "Sometimes offers get sent to landowners whose names are on file, but your aunt's deed listed you as the owner. This shows someone had inside access. Someone who knew exactly who to reach." The idea of Brianna getting a private, direct offer without the family trust knowing made the whole plan snap into place. This was never about a family argument. It was a secret, multi-million-dollar play, and Brianna had been the one holding the cards. My hands started to shake as I folded the paper and slid it back into the folder. Nora asked if I wanted a certified copy. I did, of course. I needed proof. I needed something that couldn't be waved away as hearsay. She stamped it, signed it, and the paper took on a legal weight I could feel in my palms. For the first time since the boat, the fog in my head cleared just a bit. I left the clerk's office with the paper tight against my chest like a talisman. On the walk back to my car, the town looked both smaller and more dangerous. How many people had been in on this? How long had Brianna been cooking the numbers behind everyone's back? The offer wasn't just a motive, it was a map of betrayal. When Nora slid the certified copy across the counter, I felt something shift in me. It was the kind of shift that starts small, an intake of breath that turns into a steadying exhale and then grows. The paper was heavy with more than fiber and ink, it was heavy with intention. It said clearly that someone had planned to make money off my aunt's land, and that someone had gone behind my back to do it. That was the smoking gun. It proved the motive that had been whispered about and hinted at in court filings. It proved Brianna had a direct, tangible reason to force me into signing anything. Reading the offer again, I could see the timeline. Offer sent, silence from me because I didn't know, then pressure. The lake trip came right after. The way it lined up was too neat, too careful. There was no way to call it a coincidence. Nora's copy became Exhibit A in a file that my lawyer and I stacked carefully. We'd been fighting about proof, about whether motive could be shown in a way a jury would understand. Here it was, in black and white, stamped and certified. I left the county building feeling both lighter and colder, like someone had stripped away a layer of protective skin and I was finally seeing the rawness underneath. For a while, I just sat in my car with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing. The world outside the windows hummed on as if nothing had happened, people going about their day, trucks backing into loading docks, kids getting ice cream. But inside me, a thing had settled, a readiness I hadn't felt before. This was no longer just a fight for the truth about that day. It was about a clear, ugly plot to take what belonged to me and put it in Brianna's hands so she could sell it out from under Lee. The offer letter turned my outrage into something precise. It gave the prosecution a number. It gave me a target. Back at home, I spread the letters from Aunt Carol out on the kitchen table again and placed Nora's copy on top like a crown. Aunt Carol had left me the land, and someone had tried to steal the future she'd intended. That realization hit the part of me that kept Lee awake at night, the part that kept me going through double shifts and blown-out tires and the long quiet of our house. I did not have to shout. I had a document. I had a timeline. I had proof that when they pushed, they weren't pushing for family reasons, they were pushing for millions. There was nothing sentimental about the way I folded the paper and put it in my file. It was evidence, sharp and clean, and it would be used. The week before the trial narrowed into a jagged point of focus. I slept in fits, topped off by meetings with my lawyer who paced as he explained what the evidence meant in plain language. I kept going over the offer in my head, the way it proved planning. Brianna's arrogance had been her undoing, but it would be the court's decision that finished the story. I held fast to that. The document from Nora Bennett sat in my bag like a promise. The truth could be shown. It could be read aloud. It could not be taken back. The days that followed felt like moving through a narrow tunnel with a light at the end. Sometimes I wanted to curl up and hide from everything: the trial, the whispers, the knowledge that my own family had tried to hurt us. But every time I felt that pull, I thought of Lee's face on the lake, glassy and pale, and of Aunt Carol's handwriting in the shoebox. The certified offer had given me a clean, undeniable fact to hold up in court. That fact would cut through their stories. It would reveal the greed beneath the smiles. It would, I hoped, be the lever that finally pried our lives out of my family's hands. I thought I'd been prepared for everything: the doctor's reports, the smear campaign, having my grief used like evidence. But nothing had readied me for what happened the evening the neighbor dropped off the wreath. The small, circular pine piece was meant as a kind gesture, an early Christmas thing from Mrs. Collins across the street. It smelled like winter and holiday windows, and something kinder than what had happened on the lake. I hung it on the door, and the scent hit the kitchen like a hand. The pine was sharp and alive, and it rolled through the house on a cold breath. Lee was at the table. She'd been coloring quietly, crayons scattered like small, bright flags. When the scent touched her, her whole body went still. Her face went white, and then she began to breathe fast, the way she had on the boat when she'd woken up and didn't know where she was. She dropped her crayon and covered her mouth with both hands, eyes wide and watery. "Mommy," she whispered, and then it came out in a frantic stammer, I can't breathe." It was as if the wreath had put us both back on that sun-bleached, empty boat. The smell had become a trigger, a little straw that broke a nervous camel's back. I moved to her instantly, pulling her into my lap. She trembled against me, her small body shaking with sobs that wanted to climb into her throat and never leave. I held her and rocked and tried to tell her we were safe, that we were home, that nothing like that would ever happen again, but words felt thin and foolish. The scent of pine was everywhere: the wreath, a bag of potpourri on the counter that Mrs. Collins had also sent, and each time the smell hit, Lee flinched. She crawled into a corner of the couch and pressed herself against the cushions like she could make herself invisible. That night was long and raw. Lee refused to sleep in her own bed. She wanted the light on and my hand holding hers. Every creak of the house, every passing car set her off. When she finally drifted, her tiny body curled into mine, she whispered, "Don't leave me again, Mommy. Please don't leave." The memory of making the choice to swim away from her, the thing that had saved her life, undid itself into guilt that felt physical. I'd made the choice that every parent fears making, the one that seemed like the only way and then rippled into 1,000 consequences I hadn't seen coming. For the first time since the court filings began, I questioned everything. I held her and imagined pulling a phone out, calling my lawyer and telling him to let it go, walk away, drop the charges, let the family keep their money and their respect. The idea of turning my back on the trial felt like embracing a living room full of knives. Only the knives would go into my daughter's future. The thought of her waking one day and finding that the 43 acres had been signed away, that Aunt Carol's final words had been drowned out by a stack of papers, made my stomach twist. All night I replayed the lake in my head, the slick splash when I jumped, the weight of the water against my shoulders, Lee's face pale and small. I thought about how helpless she had been and how some people had seen her as a prop, an instrument in a plan. The realization made my fists clench. Grief had shaped me into someone careful and wary, but it had also made me fierce in ways I hadn't expected. This fight was about more than revenge. It was about making a life where Lee would never be a pawn in someone else's decision. When dawn finally gray-washed the sky, Lee slept in a sleep so small and fragile it hurt me to watch. I sat on the edge of her bed and thought about the cost of what I had done. I remembered Aunt Carol's handwriting, the letters, and the offer letter in the file from Nora. Those things steadied me. They turned the gnawing doubt into a resolve so clear I could taste it. I knew the choice to continue wasn't about my pride. It was about making sure no one ever got to make my daughter small again. So I didn't call my lawyer to tell him to stop. Instead, I brewed a pot of coffee and sat down to read every piece of evidence again. My hands trembled, but the tremor was different now. It was not the shaking of someone broken. It was the steady of someone who had chosen and could live with that choice. I lifted Lee's hand and kissed her knuckles, promising myself that whatever came next, I would keep her safe. The only way out of this was through, and I was no longer willing to turn back. The courtroom smelled like old wood and coffee, the kind of smell that sits in places where people wait to have their lives rearranged. When they called my name, my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. I walked up, the click of my shoes too loud in my ears. The judge looked over me once, then down at the page in front of him. The jury watched with neutral faces, and my family sat at the defense table refusing to meet my eyes. Brianna's face was pale, mascara still streaked where she'd tried to cry. Dad stared at the table like it was a thing he could hide behind. Mom's hands were folded so tight her knuckles had gone white. When the clerk swore me in, my voice shook for a second, then steadied. I wanted my words to be the kind that could be heard across a room and count for something. I told the story slow, the way I'd learned to tell it so the important parts wouldn't be lost in the noise. I spoke about the way Brianna had smiled that day, the silver thermos she brought like a prize, and how the tea tasted wrong, too sweet, like someone had tried to hide something in sugar. I explained how Lee had leaned on me, how the world had gone dark, and how the note under the rock had been a message meant to humiliate me. I talked about the boat, the cut fuel line, the missing oars, and the sick, hot panic of watching my daughter lie there and not wake. I told them I'd written a note and tucked it into Lee's pocket and then swam, stroke after stroke, through cold, thick water until my knees hit gravel. I told them about Hank finding me on the road and Detective Rowan waiting at the clinic. I described the lab results and the thermos with Brianna's fingerprints. I held up the letters from my aunt and read the parts that mattered out loud so no one could pretend the words weren't hers. "I'm leaving the 43 acres to you, Sadie, and you alone," I said, and my voice felt like it belonged to someone who had finally decided to be seen. Being on that stand felt like walking a tightrope with the whole town watching. I wasn't shouting, I wasn't dramatic, I spoke plain. Each sentence landed and made sense. For the first time since that hot day on the lake, I felt like the story belonged to me. I was not a hysterical widow. I was a mother who had swum through a lake to save her child and who had proof that people she loved had tried to make that decision for her. When Graham got up, he carried himself with the practiced ease of someone who'd made a living arguing for other people. His questions were sharp and neatly aimed. He tried to fold me into the neat story he'd been paid to tell, the grieving widow, the woman who worked nights, the fragile mother pushed over the edge. "Isn't it true, Miss Collins, that you were deeply depressed after your husband's death?" he asked, his tone flat and accusing. He pulled out old emails, the ones I'd written to Mom on bad days, and read them like they were evidence of collapse rather than ordinary human exhaustion. He asked about my night shifts at the diner as if working evenings was a sign of instability. He suggested that my life had become smaller, that I'd withdrawn, that anyone could have seen this coming. He pushed hard on the idea that I might have medicated myself, planted the typewritten note, or staged the whole thing. He wanted me to be frantic, to look like I couldn't tell truth from fiction. But when I answered, I kept my tone even. "I was grieving," I said once. "Grief is not the same as being broken." When he raised the letters from my aunt and called them sentimental scribbles, I put myself in the middle of the room and I didn't flinch. "Those letters showed what my aunt wanted," I said. "They were honest words about who I am, they weren't proof of madness." His last gambit was personal, reaching for a crack. He asked whether I'd ever said things that sounded paranoid, whether I'd accused family members of bad motives before. I remembered every small, ordinary email where I'd pushed back and stood my ground, and I owned them. I didn't apologize for saying no. I said calmly that I had been careful for a reason and that care was not the same as instability. He tried to make me cry, he tried to make me stumble. Instead, I let the truth land like a stone and watched the ripples. Detective Rowan's testimony felt, in a way, like another safe shore. He walked the room through the facts in the same plain way I had. The toxicology reports showing sedatives in both me and Lee, the thermos lid with Brianna's fingerprints, the match between the printed paper and the ream in Brianna's home printer. He didn't use flowery language. He told the jury what the tests said and how they fit together. Then came Mom. Hearing her voice over the loudspeaker was something I'd waited for and dreaded. She read her statement slowly at first and then she cried. She said the words she'd told Detective Rowan in a small room. It was supposed to be a lesson, she'd said, to scare me into signing, to bring me back to the family. Dad looked smaller than the chair as they played his recorded statements. He had tried to call it a stupid idea that spun out of control, but the recording caught him admitting he knew details, that he'd paid for the cabin, that he'd been part of the plan. Each piece of their testimony was a collapse. When Nora Bennett stepped up, the clerk who'd pulled the offer letter for me, the air in the courtroom changed again. She showed the certified copy of the developer's offer, $2,400,000, and confirmed it had been sent straight to Brianna 6 weeks before the trip. The jurors shifted in their seats. You could feel the room inhale. When the prosecutor laid the timeline out, offer letter, secret meetings, pressure, the lake incident, the whole thing became a single, ugly story. It wasn't just a bad family spat. It was a plan with a price on it. Brianna's face drained of color as the paper was passed around. For the first time that day, I saw anger in her eyes, not the practiced sorrow, but real, simple fear. Trent's jaw clenched. The defense tried to explain, but the facts were like stones thrown into a clear pool, and the ripples reached everyone. The jury didn't take long to decide. They came back in less than 3 hours, and when the foreman stood, his hands were steady. He read the verdicts like someone reading a list of names. Brianna was found guilty of conspiracy and felony child endangerment. Trent was found guilty of conspiracy. The words landed on me with a weight that had no sharpness and no joy. I didn't celebrate. A quiet, gravity-filled thing settled in my chest. I had wanted justice, but I hadn't wanted to turn my family into a headline. Watching the judge hand down the sentences felt like watching a storm finally break. The judge spoke plainly. He gave Brianna 7 years with the possibility of parole after 4, and Trent 5 years with a minimum before any leniency. Mom and Dad had cut a deal to testify. They walked away with probation instead of prison time. The sentences were a complicated thing. Somebody else's punishment couldn't stitch up the hole their betrayal had left. But the drumbeat of that courtroom had changed something irrevocably. I stepped out of that building alone. I didn't look back. Brianna stared at the floor, her mascara a map of her performance, and Dad avoided my eyes as if guilt could be a shield. As I walked to the car with Lee's small hand in mine, the weight wasn't light. It felt more like responsibility, heavy, honest, something I could hold. The trial closed a chapter that had been open since the lake, but it didn't fix the nights Lee couldn't sleep or the smell of pine that made her flinch. It didn't make Mom and Dad into better people. It did, though, put the truth into the world where it couldn't be borrowed or rewritten. The verdict wasn't vindication in the way people expect, it was a clearing. It made room for us to breathe again and slowly to build a life that owed nothing to those who tried to take what was ours. The morning after the sentencing, I slept until the house felt like it belonged to me again. When I finally rolled out of bed, I made 2 calls before Lee woke. The first was to my lawyer. We wrapped up the trust that morning, simple, firm language that meant my aunt's 43 acres were no one's problem but Lee's. It would sit in her name, locked away until she turned 25. I pictured that land as a little island of safety, a place no one could reach to tug at her or at the life we were trying to build. The second call was quieter, but it carried the same steady intent. I called our family's financial manager and asked that every cent of my savings be moved out of the joint account they used for the holiday rentals. I didn't say it to hurt anyone. I said it because I wanted to untangle my life from the web they'd spun. The money we'd put in together had been a lifeline for their business during slow months. My small share was a big part of that lifeline. I withdrew it all and told him to transfer it into my account and to close the shared line. He didn't argue, he just did the math and said, "I'll get it done, Sadie." His voice had that polite numbness people use when bad things are settling. Within weeks, the effects were clear. Without the cushion my savings provided, 2 of their rental properties couldn't cover the mortgage payments. Notices came in the mail I'd once avoided reading, late notices, then final warnings. The phone calls started, creditors, mortgage companies, a property manager asking if someone could make an emergency payment. Their cash flow, the steady stream that had always kept their business afloat, sputtered and died. I didn't feel a thrill, I felt a strange relief, like pulling a rotten board out of a porch rail. They'd built an empire on control and convenience, and without the hidden support, it crumbled into unpaid bills and legal phone calls. People in town watched it happen like it was some slow-motion lesson. I kept to myself, I didn't gloat. The point had never been to punish for the sake of punishment. It was to stop them from ever using our lives as a ledger entry again. It was to make sure Lee had something purely hers. Seeing their business fail felt like a necessary consequence, a practical severing of a rope that had tied us to that family's plans. I had no desire to see them homeless or ruined, but I also couldn't pretend they'd not tried to ruin us. After the dust settled a little, I focused on what people said about healing, small daily things that might stitch us back together. We adopted a rescue dog with a crooked ear and a tail that wagged like a small flag. Lee named him Toby because she liked the sound. He was a mess at first, matted fur, a cough, terrified of his own shadow, but he curled right up at her feet that first night and stayed there like he'd always known he belonged. Watching them together was a kind of medicine I hadn't expected. Lee started lessons with Kayla Brooks at the community pool. Kayla was patient in a way that made the pool feel like a safe room. They began at the shallow end with toys, with blowing bubbles and kicking drills that felt more like play than training. The first time Lee swam a full lap without stopping, she came up laughing, hair plastered to her face, and I felt something open inside me. It wasn't just pride, it was proof that fear doesn't get the last word. We celebrated with hot chocolate in a small cafe afterward. The dogs snored on the linoleum by our feet. Nights grew quieter in a good way. We read on the front porch as the sky went pink and then blue and then black. Lee leaned her head on my shoulder and asked about silly things, about stars, about whether trees could get lonely. The dogs snored at our feet. Sometimes I would look at Lee's face in the lantern light and think about all the ways we'd been forced to change, and how many of those changes carved out small pieces of freedom. Our porch had no grand view. It had chipped paint and a swing that squeaked. It smelled of lemon oil from a bottle I kept for visitors. To me, it was everything. We kept going back to the letters from Aunt Carol when things felt shaky. I'd laminated a copy of her note that said she wanted me to say no. I kept it tucked into a book on the shelf. It felt like a compass you can place your finger on when the world gets loud. The trust lawyer mailed us a small confirmation letter once the paperwork was finalized. I left it on the table where Lee could see that her land was real and safe. She traced the edge of the envelope with a finger and grinned like it was a secret that belonged to us. Some evenings, when the air was soft and the street lamps blinked on, Lee would dip her toes in the kiddie pool on the back porch while Toby nosed at a stick. She'd practice blowing bubbles and call out how far she could go, and I would clap and cheer and feel quietly that the work had been worth it. We weren't the same as before, we'd lost a lot, but we had the choice to build a small, stubborn life that belonged to only us. Family secrets can be the most dangerous. If you've ever had to fight to tell your own story, share it in the comments. Your voice matters. Please subscribe and keep watching for more stories of survival and strength.